Hello, and thank you for attending our session today. My name is Dr. Catherine Parada. I am an assistant professor of middle grades and secondary education at Mercer University Tift College of Education at the Atlanta campus. And my co-author and co-researcher is Dr. Tiffany McBean Rainey, who is a virtual content specialist with DeKalb County Schools here in Atlanta, Georgia. Our presentation today is titled Emphatically Our Battle, a content analysis of the African Free School of New York curriculum, which was in operation from 1787 to 1840. This presentation is prepared for the National Council of Social Studies College and University Faculty Assembly virtual conference in November 2021. As a side note, I am presenting our research today on behalf of my co-researcher. She just gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and we're just really excited that that her and her daughter are doing really well. So again, thank you for coming to this presentation, and I'm really happy to share with you our project and our findings and implications for future research as it relates to social studies education. The abstract of our research is as follows. The African Free School of New York City was established in 1787 by the New York Manumission Society, aimed at providing an education and moral uplift for the children of freedmen and former enslaved people after the American Revolution. Few studies exist that specifically examine the curriculum of the African Free School and how the Black community's involvement in the schools impacted the curriculum taught to the students at these schools. As a side note, the African Free School started with one school and then eventually expanded. There is a need to examine the African Free School curriculum in order to ascertain whether the goal of the school was to serve the free community as a vehicle for civil rights and socioeconomic and political emancipation, or if the school curriculum was a tool for assimilation into white segregated society, particularly in the antebellum North. The purpose of our study and research question is as follows. The purpose of this study is to examine the African Free School curriculum in order to ascertain whether the goal of the school was to serve the free community as a vehicle for civil rights and socioeconomic and political enfranchisement, or a tool for adoption into white segregated society. The research question is, was the African Free School curriculum a vehicle of Black assimilation and moral uplift from slavery, or was it an example of radical curriculum with regard to its emancipatory goals for the children of freedmen in antebellum New York City? Before we jump into the methodology and findings of this study, we present to you a brief history of the African Free School. In 1787, members of the New York Manumission Society and the Quakers, also known as the Society of Friends, established the African Free School in New York City for the children of former enslaved people and to shield freedmen from kidnapping to be sold into slavery in the South. Among the prominent members of the New York Manumission Society included John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. The goals of the school aligned with the perspective of moral uplift of Blacks through education and to avoid vice and maintain sobriety as assimilating into white society. The African Free School was modeled around Anglican charity schools. This is coming off of the heels of the American Revolution, and as we know, New York was formerly a British colony. And the method of teaching that was used at the school was known as the Lancastrian method. And this was a method in which older students served as monitors to teach younger children. So typically you had all grade levels together with one teacher or headmaster, and so older students would assist the teacher in instructing the younger children in attendance. A basic curriculum of English, mathematics, and geography were taught to all the children. Eventually, the school expanded from just admitting boys and also girls in the early 1800s. Boys were taught nautical skills, stock market calculations, considering New York City's New York City's position, the word escaped me, New York City's position at this time as a major port city, the home of the stock exchange. So boys were taught these skills. Girls were taught needlepoint and other types of fine arts. There were several problems that faced the African Free School throughout its time of operation. The New York Manumission Society were dependent on white benefactors and philanthropists for funding. Other schools that opened in New York City during this time in the early 1800s received public funds. The Manumission Society did not want to accept those funds and so relied solely on donations from wealthy whites in the city. Because funding was an issue, there were major disparities in teacher salaries of black and white teachers and administrators. For example, some of the white teachers who were hired and then left were replaced by black teachers who were paid significantly less. The New York Manumission Society did not support black self-reliance and activism. John Teasman, who was once an assistant at the school, eventually became head teacher, and he was paid significantly less than his white predecessor. When he was involved in Independence Day celebrations, July 4th celebrations in the black community in Lower Manhattan, in which he was seen carrying the emblem, "Am I not a man and a brother?" to highlight issues of racial discrimination in New York and in the North, as well as the continuance of the institution of slavery in the southern states. John Teasman was terminated from his position as teacher in the African Free School. The Manumission Society replaced him with Charles C. Andrews, a white British teacher. And Andrews eventually is terminated from his position. He held the job for about 10 years. And there was an incident at the school where an African-American gentleman came to the door, and one of the black male students went and answered the door and told Charles Andrews that a gentleman was there to see him. And after the gentleman left, the boy was reprimanded and caned. And there was a lot of outrage in the black community over the caning. It is assumed in the texts that Andrews was reprimanding the student in terms of speaking out of turn to an adult, and this might have been attributed to his training over in Britain, but nonetheless, this example of corporal punishment was sparked outrage among parents and community activists, and eventually Andrews was terminated and replaced by black teachers. So that was an example in which parents in the community rallied to support their children to be educated by those who were in support of the goals, of the values, and to address the needs of the black community during the early 19th century. There were a lot of criticisms amongst the parents and of the black community over the curriculum at the African Free School. Children were interviewed for enrollment in the school, and they were interviewed by white teachers of the school, even some African American representatives of the school, such as Samuel Cornish. And they were interviewed in order to be admitted upon the evaluation of the Manumission Society that their families would uphold certain standards of behavior, appearance, industry, or basically maintaining employment. And that was very much in contrast to what parents needed and wanted from their children, particularly to engage in activity of self-reliance and to be able to engage in economic mobility in New York City. These children were getting a pretty elite education, and yet there were institutional barriers to racial equality in antebellum New York City. And parents were critical of the curriculum. They were critical of the oratories that students would give during what were called examination days, where pretty much the children would be engaging in public speaking and reciting poetry and speeches to highlight the curriculum and goals of the school as a means to solicit donations from philanthropists and white benefactors in the city to support the school. But the parents were really concerned that these oratories were not expressing the needs of the community, again, especially with regard to Black employment. A lot of students who received this education in nautical skills, mathematical skills, geography skills, could not get jobs with the stock exchange or with the maritime companies due to issues of racial discrimination. And so that, on top of the termination of John Teasman, on top of the caning incident with Charles Andrews, led to a lot of parental involvement in the schools. But ultimately, by 1840, the New York Manumission Society negotiated transfer of school operations to private organizations. And eventually the African Free School was co-opted into the New York City Board of Education, and the schools were then relegated to be their colored schools throughout, at the time, the borough of Manhattan. By 1840, slavery had been abolished in New York State. That happened in 1827. And the Manumission Society, facing funding issues and also feeling that they had already achieved their goal of educating the children of freedmen and shielding freedmen and their children from potential kidnapping to the South, felt like they did not need to support the school anymore. And so what ends up happening is, once the schools become part of the New York City Board of Education, the African Free School, which again was enrolled children in primary grades through high school, were pretty much relegated to its colored schools, and in many cases relegated to just elementary schools. So children, African American children, who would go on to, let's say, beyond an elementary education, would not be able to do so in the New York City Board of Education as they could have if the African Free School remained in operation. But despite these issues and these significant challenges that faced the operations of the African Free School and faced their students and African American staff and faculty, they came together and made an indelible mark on the history of education in this country, not just in New York City, but the entire United States. Several prominent alumni graduated from the African Free School during the 1800s. Some of these notable alumni include James McCune Smith, who went on to become an abolitionist and a doctor, Henry Highland Garnett, another notable abolitionist, and Elizabeth Jennings Graham. Now, she was a child. She attended the school when she was a child, and when she became a teacher in the New York City Board of Education, she ended up teaching in some of these in the colored schools that were the former African Free School. She was also a major proponent of African American education and African American civil rights in antebellum New York City. The African Free School provided an elite education to African American children that they may not have been able to receive elsewhere. Other schools existed that were similar in states like Pennsylvania. And so to have this school in New York City as being the first capital of the United States following the Revolution and being the juggernaut of economic growth of the United States in the early years of the Republic was really important. The legacy of the African Free School, unfortunately, was indicative of the racist and paternalistic attitudes that precluded highly educated blacks from socioeconomic and political equity in New York and other northern states during the antebellum era. However, the Black community was involved in matters of the school curriculum and administration of the African Free School that led to changes and the beginnings of emancipatory education in the post-revolution era that is relevant on many levels today that we will discuss shortly. Cynthia Tyson's emancipatory theoretical framework is the framework in which that guided our data collection and analysis. According to the emancipatory theoretical framework, the researchers are examining documents in order to identify challenges to hierarchical relationships in curriculum materials and research methodologies. The researcher needs to identify and respond to issues of race, privilege, and power that are indicative in these documents and curricular materials. The researcher needs to ask who benefits from this research and this data as we seek to examine critical issues. And the researcher also seeks to dismantle deficit models of education that predominantly impact Black children and students of color. We considered these 4 points throughout our engagement of our methodology and again of our analysis of the curricular materials of the African Free School with regard to examining how the materials highlighted issues and challenges of hierarchical relationships between those in power, so teachers and administrators and students. We examined the documents in order to identify and respond to implicit and explicit issues of race, privilege, and power that were in these materials. We asked about who benefited from the products from the curricular materials and the tasks that the students achieved in the curriculum. And we also looked at a broader picture of how these documents were exemplars of how to dismantle deficit models of education that not only impacted Black children in the African Free School, but also children of color in our 21st century. We conducted a qualitative content analysis for this study. We decided to embark on this methodology instead of writing a traditional historical narrative because we wanted to engage in Tyson's emancipatory theoretical framework in order to examine how these curricular documents, again, were indicative of hierarchical power challenges, how these documents could be analyzed to dismantle issues of racial discrimination in curriculum materials. A content analysis is a research technique for making replicable and valid inferences from texts to the context of their use. We cite Krippendorf here as well and used his framework for content analysis methodology in this study. In order to conduct an effective content analysis, then the interpretation of text such as maps, images, sounds, and symbols are inherently qualitative. So meaning as it's very subjective in a lot of cases when looking at these 51 documents in the African Free School digital archive that is housed by the New York Historical Society. It's very subjective in nature in terms of connecting meaning of these texts, symbols, images to analysis and application of the emancipatory theoretical framework. In particular, we engaged in discourse analysis throughout this content analysis, where we asked questions and sought answers about how terms and concepts that are organized into those texts, how those terms and concepts can be organized and be synthesized to, again, articulate meaning, which is inherently qualitative, but overall looking to see, are these documents indicative of an emancipatory curriculum, or were these curricular materials indicative of assimilation and moral uplift for the children of the African Free School, and how those findings can be applicable and relevant to education of children of color today. We engaged in several rounds of coding as we collected and analyzed these documents. The first round of coding was descriptive coding process, where we previewed, interpreted, and discussed the documents. Again, in the New York Historical Society Digital Archive examination days, where these curricular materials of the African Free School are housed, there are 51 documents total. We initially created 17 categories and 17 categories during this first round of coding, and then we settled on 4 categories and 3 subcategories in which to organize the materials. We engaged in second and third rounds of coding, where we used deduce software to further focus and narrow down the subcategories, which did shift quite a bit with regard to the qualitative and subjective nature of content analysis. We really had to go through each document several times in order for us to come to a consensus of whether or not these documents were indicative of an emancipatory curricular material or an assimilation/moral uplift goal for these materials. And then we settled on our final categories and subcategories, which included the main categories. We organized the curricular materials into their content areas, including literature and penmanship, mathematics and economics, character traits, arts and maps, and also a category for teacher materials. We asterisked that because this wouldn't necessarily be a curricular material that students would have completed, but the archive does include some of the lesson plans that teachers had created, and so we put that as a category here for the documents. And then once we settled upon these categories, we then coded each document according to their subcategory, whether or not the documents were indicative of assimilation, moral uplift, or emancipatory curriculum. And so the next couple of slides shows the coding tables in which where we organized each document, including its number or its order, sequential order, in the digital archive on the New York Historical Society. We have the document name. We gave a description of the document and a description of what it was, who produced it, when, the code, so meaning again the subcategory of whether or not it was emancipatory, moral uplift, or assimilation, and then connected it to a secondary code, so connecting it to its content area, and also whether or not it was emancipatory or assimilation. And we had that secondary code there because some documents overlapped in that some had sentiments of emancipatory curriculum and some also echoed some of the assimilation attitudes of moral uplift of the school in the documents. So we have a table in which we categorize these documents as arts and maps, the arts and maps category. We have the character traits category, and again broken down into its subcategory code of either moral uplift and whether or not there was a secondary code for the document with regard to whether or not it was assimilation or emancipatory. We have another coded table of documents that were categorized as indicative of literature and penmanship in the curricular materials, and then math and economics. So after doing these several rounds of coding, we found that the majority of the African Free School curricular documents did not explicitly promote emancipatory curriculum for its students. Some materials were obviously not intended to be emancipatory, but actually rather cautionary for Black students to express gratitude for the role of the school in the moral uplift of students. Remember, students had to be interviewed in order to be admitted into the school. And those interviews also included interviews with their families. And so a lot of the documents that we found in the archive were very much geared towards the emphasis that they were very lucky and fortunate to be at the school, and they were very lucky and fortunate to be receiving this education, and that if they were to engage in vice or any kind of behaviors that the Manumission Society deemed as inappropriate, that it would be a major disappointment to their families, to the school, and to their community. But despite the fact that the African Free School documents were not specifically intended to foster emancipatory curriculum, students did demonstrate evidence of implicit and explicit sentiments concerning matters of race, justice, and equality in their oratories and in their writings. Some students expressed some agency in expressing these emancipatory views in original poems, samplers, and oratories. So, for example, documents that we coded as examples of assimilation were ones that were developed to highlight standards of beauty or Western standards of what were images of purity or innocence, as we see here in Andrew Smith's sketch of this white woman here, titled Standards of Beauty. And this sketch here by student Thomas Latin of a Roman man entitled Innocence. These sketches do demonstrate that the students had immense artistic talents. However, the New York Historical Society does note in its archival notes that nowhere in this archive, or this volume, if you will, or category of curriculum materials of art, do we find a portrait of a Black subject. So students who were being instructed on art techniques, character traits, and what those looked like were instructed to examine standards of beauty, purity, and innocence from a white perspective. So these students did not get a chance to really engage in their artistic abilities to express standards of beauty and innocence as relevant to who they were and their cultures and their backgrounds and their communities. We also have this example here of Richard Finch's penmanship. A lot of math and economics documents were also categorized in the category of art and penmanship because it was very much an art skill to be able to engage in calligraphy style writing of text and numbers. Again, examples of penmanship were categorized as assimilation. The math and economics documents, such as Richard Finch's practice here, was also cross-coded as emancipatory in terms of gaining these mathematical skills to be able to obtain employment and engage in economic mobility. But we included this penmanship document here to show that a lot of the curriculum that focused on the deficits of vice of those who were of people of color after the American Revolution was very prominent here, where the majority of the curriculum was Eurocentric and did not take into account the experiences of the children, their communities, nor the teachers' knowledge of the community assets that the children brought to the school. Other documents that were coded as moral uplift focused on these cautionary tales of, again, what could happen if a child slipped into temptation or engaged in risky behaviors, or again behaviors and activities that were deemed inappropriate by the benefactors and the trustees of the New York Manumission Society and the administration of the school. So here, this example, the emblem of education, this was created by student Henry Hill, and he draws this drooping tree emblem and used it as a symbol to demonstrate a lesson or a lesson or a moral for students. And in this emblem, he writes, and I'm going to read the transcription here, as it's a little blurry on the screen. Thus, prudent care must rear the youthful mind, by love supported, with toil refined. 'Tis this alone the human plant can rise, unpropped it droops, and unsupported dies. So very much this emblem of a drooping tree and the text that Henry Hill wrote was indicative of moral uplift, again as aimed at promoting Black assimilation into mainstream white society. To be unsupported, unpropped, and then it droops and dies, referring to the education that they were receiving at the school, and that they were expected to maintain certain standards of behavior concerning sobriety and modesty. So even though this is very much an example of artistic talent, as seen in the emblem illustration and the penmanship, the message itself is really clear that students were expected to express gratitude for the role of the school to prevent them from slipping into behaviors of insobriety and vice. But there were examples of emancipatory materials in the curriculum, as seen by these examples: On the Lion and an excerpt from a valedictory speech. On the Lion was an original poem written by William Seaman, and this poem emphasizes his pride in his African identity. In the poem, William Seaman writes, and I'm just excerpting this here: On Afric's dark and sultry shore, this mighty beast is heard to roar, and off on dry and barren grounds he most majestically stands. So despite the fact the emphasis on African nobility could be seen as one of assimilation, we decided that Seaman's poem can be considered an example of an emancipatory curricular material because of his cognizance of having an African identity that was strong and distinct from that of the Eurocentric curriculum that was mainly taught in the school. Furthermore, this excerpt from Andrew Smith's valedictory address could be seen as emancipatory because of his advice to his classmates. As I read transcript here, let me remind you, my fellow schoolmates, who are about to leave with me, that we are now entering into a wild field, and that we must be industrious and upright to make respectable members of society and to be an honor to our parents' request. We must make such use of our learning as will prove a blessing to ourselves and to the community with which Providence now calls us to mix. Again, although Smith's address expresses the notions of assimilation and moral uplift in the African free school curriculum, the fact that he bluntly calls upon his classmates in the fuller text of the speech to be prepared for entering into uncertain times fraught with racial violence, colonization, kidnapping, can be evidence of emancipatory curriculum, because Smith calls upon his classmates to use their education and race consciousness as active members of the free community. So overall, while the available materials of the African Free School were not intended to promote emancipatory curriculum, students exercised some agency in expressing their emancipatory views. And as stated earlier, several alumni became active abolitionists during the antebellum era throughout the North. So, again, these are just some examples of the larger archive that is available digitally by the New York Historical Society. There are limitations to this study, but also several implications for future research that we hope that this leads to. The methodology is limited. We know that content analysis is highly subjective and qualitative, and while that in itself is not a limitation, these texts can have multiple meanings, so they can be coded in several different ways. We went through 4 rounds of coding, and we really did determine that an independent check and evaluation of our findings, not only of the coding categories and subcategories, but also of our findings and how we interpreted these documents, would have been highly beneficial. We also would love to make a physical trip to the New York Historical Society archive. COVID-19 has certainly put a damper on our travel plans. The archive was closed for quite a bit of time. I believe it is now reopened in Manhattan. However, we need to be careful with our travel since we have children who are too young to be vaccinated at this point. But it is certainly on our to-do list for future research projects to go up there and visit the archive. Our future studies on free schools of color in northern states would provide greater historical understandings of states' approaches to Black education, particularly in border states that remained in the Union but maintained legal slavery until 1865. We suggest that more research be conducted on prominent Black alumni to examine the emancipatory impact and legacy of the African Free School. We also recommend that further research should focus on the social studies curriculum at large in order to prepare students to recognize, challenge, and overcome the systemic injustices that exist. We are living in some very interesting times, maybe as a result of, or because of, or simultaneously due to COVID, but the controversies stemming from the 1619 Project versus the previous administration's 1776 Project and pro-American curriculum are examples in which we really need to examine the social studies curriculum to prepare students for these challenges and controversies that can hamper racial equity and progress. These are just 2 examples. Since we wrote this paper, the nationwide debate on CRT can be an example. Mask mandates, there's so many things. The legacy of the social justice movements as a result of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter movement. There's so much in which we can build future studies from this content analysis of these curricular documents of the African Free School. And so in conclusion, Black activists, parents, students, and community members have been demanding racial equality and equity in American education, law enforcement, housing, and employment for centuries. Consequently, our aim of conducting this content analysis is to demonstrate for practitioners, scholars, administrators, leaders, community members, and other stakeholders that examination of the curricular documents of Black schools, such as the African Free School in New York City, may teach us lessons in the 21st century, namely how important it is to be culturally relevant, to engage in culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies, to know who our students are, to incorporate their assets, their community backgrounds, their heritage, their legacies, their representation in the curriculum in order to support their achievement for future socioeconomic and political success, and empower children to apply the education they received to taking informed action, a la the NCSS C3 framework, Dimension 4 of the inquiry arc, in their communities, and how that can be, and how to look at this type of informed action and community service can be and should be considered emancipatory. So please let us know if you have any questions. We have several selected secondary sources that we are happy to share with you, selected primary sources that we are happy to share with you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is in the program. Thank you for attending our presentation, and we look forward to seeing you next year at CUFA. Have a wonderful day.